Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Fast English. I'm Charlotte, your host, and with me as always, is my co-host, Liam. Today, we're diving deep into climate change, a topic that seems to stir up more controversy than you'd expect. This conversation is designed for you, to enhance your listening and speaking proficiency and be able to talk like natives. After listening to the conversation, write down your comments in a few sentences, to help improve your writing skills as well. Now let's get started. Liam, what do you think about this issue?
I think we need to have an honest conversation about the way we frame climate change. There's this overwhelming narrative out there that says, if you don't believe climate change is the biggest existential threat we face, you're ignorant. But come on, there's more to the conversation than, it's all sad and tragic.
But isn't that the point, Liam? The overwhelming narrative is that, we are in a crisis. I mean, we're talking about rising sea levels, extreme weather, mass extinctions, and, let's not forget, millions of climate refugees in the future. How can you ignore that?
It's not about ignoring it. I get that the climate is changing, okay? But my issue is with the alarmist tone that dominates every discussion about it. It's like, the moment you question whether all these extreme scenarios are going to play out exactly as predicted, you're labeled a denier. But shouldn't we be allowed to question the models, the predictions? There's this idea that all these catastrophic events will all happen, but the future isn't quite known.
Liam, we're not talking about some hypothetical future that may or may not happen, depending on how things play out. We're seeing the impacts right now. Look at the wildfires in California, Australia, Greece, record-breaking temperatures all over the world. Maybe there are uncertainties in the models, but the overall trends are perfectly clear. Climate change is real, and it's happening faster than we thought.
But are we really seeing more wildfires because of climate change, or are we seeing more wildfires because we're building in areas where they're bound to happen anyway? There's been more human development in wildfire-prone areas, plus, fire suppression policies for decades, that have made forests ticking time bombs. Not everything is due to climate change. It's a combination of poor land management, bad policy, and, sure, changing weather patterns. But let's not pretend it's just global warming lighting these fires.
That's part of it, yes. But you can't deny the role of increasing temperatures and prolonged lack of rain, which are both tied to climate change. It's like you're looking for any excuse to free climate change from responsibility. You can't separate these issues. The science is clear that climate change exacerbates natural disasters, makes them more frequent and more intense.
But see, this is what I mean about the alarmism. Every time there's a disaster, climate change gets the blame, as if it's the singular cause. And it's the same with sea level rise. We keep hearing about these dramatic predictions of cities underwater, like New York and Miami disappearing. But then, we find out that land subsidence, cities literally sinking, is just as big of a factor in some of these places. We should be looking at all the causes, not just picking the one that fits the climate change narrative.
You're missing the forest for the trees, Liam. Sure, sea level rise isn't just one thing, land subsidence might be a local factor. But the fact remains that global sea levels are rising. That's because glaciers and ice sheets are melting at alarming rates. The planet is getting warmer, the oceans are expanding, and coastal areas are increasingly at risk. You can't just pick some data points and say, oh well, it's probably not as bad as everyone says.
And you can't pick the most frightening scenarios, and act like they're inevitable. Yes, the situation is serious. But people need to know that it's not hopeless.
But Liam, it is urgent. We have a window to prevent the worst outcomes. And that's what scientists were trying to convey. They said, we have 12 years to save the world, and our actions during this critical time would determine how bad the impacts would get. It's about minimizing the damage, not pretending we can somehow avoid it entirely.
Look, I get it. I know we need to act, and I'm not saying we should just sit back and do nothing. What I'm arguing is just saying, we're all in a tragic situation, unless we change everything overnight, is not productive. You want people to take action, right? Then stop trying to scare them, and focus on what we can do practically.
But if people don't understand that, then they won't take the issue seriously. It's not just about planting a few trees, and calling it a day. It's about, fundamentally, changing how we live, how we consume, and how we generate energy. And I know that sounds radical, but the situation demands radical solutions.
Sure. But do you honestly think that's going to happen? You're talking about restructuring global economies, completely changing energy infrastructure, and expecting every government to cooperate. I'm not against renewable energy, or cutting emissions. But we need a realistic approach.
We need to keep all options on the table, including nuclear energy. But it's not just about power generation. It's about protecting ecosystems, transitioning to sustainable agriculture, rethinking transportation, reducing consumption. This is a systemic problem that requires systemic change.
And that's my issue with the climate movement. The solutions sound perfect, but they are great on paper, and impossible to implement at scale. You can't tell developing countries that they have to stay poor, because the planet's overheating. You can't expect people to give up modern conveniences, without offering a viable alternative. What's the realistic plan?
We have to start somewhere, and every small step matters. The fact is, whether we like it or not, the climate is changing. And the longer we delay, the harder it's going to be to adapt.
Agreed. I just think we need to have an honest conversation about what's feasible, not just idealistic. I'm all for progress, but we need practical, scalable solutions.
Fair enough. I think we can agree on that. But let's not lose sight of the urgency. It's not about being alarmist. It's about being realistic, about the consequences of lack of action.
Absolutely. What's your perspective, dear listeners? Drop your comments and share your opinions with us. We love to hear you.